All right, hello once again, Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and as part of the Rankin Technical College Application and Website Development 1111 Database-Driven Web Development course, I've been doing a series of videos that are based off of mainly the website of Mr. Flavio Copes, that being the Valley of Code. And for his handbooks here, he's got 12 of them right now, and I've grabbed 3 of them to start with. The HTML handbook, the CSS handbook, and the JavaScript handbook, because these 3 represented client-side web development. So I did those. Then I went back and added a couple videos that I'd done in the AWD1111 class, which were on JavaScript basics. And then finally, I went in and I also added some lectures based off of Brad Traversy's Web Dev Guide. All right, just to get people kind of a review of what we had talked about in the AWD1000 class. All right, so I've done Mr. Copes' HTML handbook, CSS handbook, and JavaScript handbook. So now I'm into his NodeJS handbook. Notice there's 161 pages. And I wanted to start up again here, talking about file descriptors. And this is the stuff that works with the file system. I should mention, as we start, you've seen this before, so I'm going to show it to you again. That is here, if I go to NodeJS.org and I go down to the API docs, you'll notice that the file system is one of those things that is built into. It is built into Node. So there's nothing special we have to do for it. You'll also notice that for most things that you do in here, maybe not everything, but for most things that you do in here, there is a way to do it both synchronously and asynchronously. All right, so we're going to go through the file system now, and a little bit later, I don't know if it's the next one or not, but we're going to go in and we're going to talk about the operating system, which again, another built-in Node.js API like the file system is. All right, so let's just jump into the file system. It says before you're able to interact with a file that sits in your file system, you must get a file descriptor, which is a reference to an open file. All right, it's something that's returned by opening the file using the open method in the FS module. It'll uniquely identify it. So right there, all right, we are telling it basically that we want to be able to bring in what's available in the FS or file system API portion of Node.js. Then we're telling it to open a file. Here's our path to that file. All right, ERR, we're not doing anything there. That's what will happen if we either give it a wrong path, or if the file doesn't exist, or we don't have permissions to use that file, or something else. But after we open this, we now have a file descriptor, something called FD. And we're also opening it up with read permission. All right. There's other ones. There's R+ for reading and writing. And notice if the file doesn't exist, it is not created. There's W+, which is the same as R+, except if the file does not exist, it is created. There's A to append onto the end of an existing file. And there's A+, again, to append to the end of the existing file. But if for some reason the file doesn't exist, it'll be created. As it says here, you can also open up a file by using the fs or file system.OpenSync. All right, when you do that, there's no callback then. Once you get the file descriptor, whether you do it synchronously, which like they show here, or asynchronously, which is normally what you see, you can perform all operations that require it. In other words, once it's open, you can read from it, you can write to it, you can append it, you can remove it, you can close it, for instance. You can also open a file by using the promise-based fspromises.open method. All right, it says it's only available if you're using Node version 14 or later, since we're using 16.16.0 course, we could do it that way, and they show an example of that. Now, this is the kind of thing that typically, when you are starting off talking about Node, that you'll go through stuff like this. All right. That said, how much work you'll actually do using Node with files, it's going to depend. All right. Personally, I think you'd be doing a lot more work with Node and databases than you would with Node and files. All right. Every file comes with a set of details you can inspect using Node, in particular the stat method. It says you call it passing a file path, and it'll come back giving you some of the information. So there's the stats. Now, typically, notice it says there, if there's an error, just console.error it. Sometimes you're going to see that it's going to throw the error. I mean, more often than not, that's what I've done if there's an error situation, because if you throw the error, typically if it's such an egregious situation where you can't go on, you want to stop. All right. With the sync method, as it says, you can do that using a try catch. The file information is included in the stats variable. So what kind of information can you get in there? And it says a lot. You can see if the file is a directory or a file, if it's a symbolic link, the size of the file, and there are other things that you can get as well. Every file in the file system has a path. As it says there, on Linux or Mac, you'll use the / typically, and on Windows, typically the \. You need to pay attention when using paths in your app, and these differences must be taken into account. If you want to be able to use the file path, that's another thing that is built in, meaning it does not have to be installed. So there's no node I path. Rather, again, if we come out here and we come back up here and we look, there's path, which again is used. You'll notice it's not that big, but it's used typically in conjunction with working with files. Given a path, this is some of the information that you can get out of it. The directory name, the file name base, which means the file name without the extension, and the file extension. You can join two or more parts of a path together with path.join. Why might you want to do that? Again, if you were going to go in and create your own file, you might tell the system where you want the file to live and then add to that, all right, exactly where you want it to live in that in there. Okay. All right. The simplest way to read a file in Node.js is to use the fs.readFile method. But again, as far as that goes, all right, I'm not saying you'll never use this, but I don't use it very often at all in my work with Node. I'm not trying to downplay its importance. It's just that you tend to use databases a lot more, in my humble opinion, than you do files. So here they're doing a read file, and they're saying if there was an error, do a console.error or return, and then return. Otherwise, log it, so show the data that's in there. And again, there's asynchronous ways of doing it and synchronous ways of doing it, and promise-based ways of doing it. All right. It says this means that big files are going to have a major impact on your memory consumption and the speed of execution in the program. It says in this case, a better option is to read the file content using streams, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. All right. Not only can you read files with Node, you can write files or write to files with Node. All right. So we're opening it up here, but we're opening it up with write file as opposed to read file. So we're trying to write that content that was defined up here to this file. And again, you can do it promise-based, etc. By default, it says it'll replace the contents of the file if it already does exist. So for that reason, you're typically going to, if you know that it's an existing file, you're typically going to want to open it up with, for example, A+ or A, all right, which puts you into append mode. So as mentioned, a handy method to append content to an end of the file is the append file. And again, there are different ways that you can do this. Typically what happens in here, and they don't talk a lot about it in any of these, but you have usually what's called a file pointer. And the file pointer shows you where you currently are in the file. So if it's a brand new file, the file pointer would typically be at position 0. But if you were working with a file that was already there and you wanted to add to it, you'd want to point the file pointer to the end of the file so you could be appending onto the end of it. All right, let's quickly go through streams here. And it says all these methods write the full content of the file before returning control back to the program. Again, the better option is to write it using streams just like it was for reading. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a little bit. All right, you can work with folders. You can check to see if a folder exists. Why might you want to do that? Because if you were going to create a new folder, you might want to make sure there wasn't already a folder there with that name, as an example. All right, you can read the entire contents of a directory. You can also filter those results to only give it what you're looking for. For instance, you probably wouldn't want to try to read an executable file because it would look like garbage anyway. So you might only want it to look, and you might want to filter it to see if it was a text file or something like that. You can do the standard types of folder operations. You can rename a folder. You can remove a folder. Removing a folder, it says, that has content can be more complicated than you need. You can pass the option recursive true to recursively remove its contents. What that means is if you don't do that, what can happen is the system could come in and say, you can't remove this folder, it still has content in it. It says, as of version 16, which we're using, the recursive option has been deprecated. All right, for filesystem.rmdir for remove directory of the callback. Okay. All right. The FS module has a lot of things that we haven't even discussed in it. Again, since it comes as part of the big API, there's no need to install it. All you have to do is require it. Once you do, you have access to all of its methods, and they give you examples of some of them here. I'm not going to read any of them to you. Here's some more and more. And they mention here one peculiar thing about the FS or file system module is that all the methods are asynchronous by default. But again, you can make them work synchronously by appending sync to them. So rename versus rename sync, write versus write sync, etc., which, as it says, can make a huge difference in the application flow of the program, depending on how big the file might be. So in this example with the sync, it says the key difference here is that the execution of the script will block in the second example until the file operation has succeeded. It says you can use the promise base to avoid using callbacks all the time, which may cause that callback hell. We've talked about this before, where you've got to, this has got to end, and then this has got to end, and this has got to end, etc. And you quite often will do that. You can do it in different ways. All right, again, you can do it, all right, promise-based like we've got right here. All right, and there's a way to do it with async await, I believe, as well. All right, the path module, as mentioned right here, provides useful functionality to interact with the file system. Again, you don't have to install it. But what you're going to find is if you're working and doing a lot of work with the file system, typically you're going to also bring in the path. All right. And as it says, it provides things like path.base name to return the last portion of the path, path.dir name for the directory name, path.ext name for the extension, path.format, which returns a path string from an object, and there's other things as well. Path.isAbsolute, is join, normalize. It doesn't pay to go over these. It really and truly does not. All right. Now, next, I'm going to go over the OS module. It's probably a little early. We're only 16 minutes in, but some of this stuff is so disjoint, so to speak, or at least somewhat disjoint, that I want to put each one of these in their own lesson. So I'll come back and talk about the OS module in just a couple moments.